The community center buzzed with excitement as veterans from 3 generations gathered for the annual Memorial Day celebration. Tables lined the walls, decorated with red, white, and blue ribbons, while the smell of coffee and homemade cookies filled the air. Children ran between the tables, their laughter mixing with the deeper voices of older men sharing war stories. In the far corner sat Harold Mitchell, an 82-year-old veteran whose weathered hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the collection of medals pinned to his faded military jacket. His gray hair was neatly combed, and despite his age, his posture remained straight and proud. The medals caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, a Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and several service ribbons that spoke of battles fought decades ago. Harold had arrived early, as he always did. He preferred the quiet moments before the crowd gathered, when he could sit peacefully and remember his fallen comrades. His wife Martha had passed 2 years ago, and these gatherings had become his main connection to the community. He watched the room slowly fill with families, some recognizing him with respectful nods, others too young to understand the significance of the decorations on his chest. Near the entrance, a group of teenagers clustered around the refreshment table. Among them was Tyler Morrison, a 17-year-old high school student known for his quick wit and louder-than-necessary opinions. Tyler had been dragged to the event by his grandmother, who insisted the family should show respect for veterans. But Tyler felt out of place among the older crowd and compensated by trying to entertain his friends with jokes and commentary. As the afternoon progressed, more veterans arrived, each wearing their service medals with quiet dignity. Some walked with canes, others in wheelchairs pushed by caring family members. The room gradually transformed from a simple community gathering into a living museum of American military history. Stories began to flow, tales of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood forged in the heat of battle. Harold noticed how some of the younger attendees seemed uncomfortable, unsure of how to interact with the veterans. He remembered being their age, once before the war changed everything. Before he learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear but acting despite it. Before he understood that some experiences leave marks that never fully heal, but also create bonds that last forever. Dear C. Event coordinator Mrs. Patricia Williams moved through the crowd with practiced ease, ensuring everyone felt welcome. She had organized this gathering for 15 years, watching as some veterans aged and others passed away. Each year she worried there might be fewer attendees, but somehow the community always came together to honor those who served. Tyler's attention drifted as the afternoon wore on. He checked his phone repeatedly, wishing he could leave to meet his friends at the mall. The stories all seemed the same to him, old men talking about things that happened before he was born. He failed to see the relevance to his life, viewing the whole event as an outdated tradition his grandmother clung to for sentimental reasons. As the crowd grew larger, conversations became animated. Veterans who hadn't seen each other in months exchanged updates about their health, their grandchildren, and their struggles with government benefits. Younger family members listened with varying degrees of attention, some genuinely interested, others clearly present only out of obligation. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room as more people arrived. Local politicians made their rounds, shaking hands and posing for photos. Business owners who sponsored the event mingled with military families, creating a mixture of genuine respect and civic duty that characterized such gatherings in small American towns. Harold remained in his corner, occasionally joined by fellow veterans who would sit beside him for a few minutes, sharing quiet words about battles fought and friends lost. His medals seemed heavier today, weighted not just with metal but with memories of young men who never made it home. He wondered if anyone truly understood what these decorations represented, not just individual acts of heroism, but moments when ordinary people did extraordinary things because their country and their brothers in arms depended on them. The stage at the front of the room stood empty, waiting for the formal program to begin. Microphones were tested, chairs arranged, and programs distributed. The informal mingling period was drawing to a close, and soon the real purpose of the gathering would begin: to honor those who served and remember those who gave everything for their country. Tyler glanced at the old man in the corner, noting the impressive display of medals but feeling no particular connection to their meaning. In his teenage mind, these were relics of ancient conflicts that had no bearing on his modern world of social media, college applications, and weekend parties. He had no idea that within the next hour, his casual dismissal of Harold's service would lead to a moment that would change his understanding of honor, sacrifice, and respect forever. The formal program began with Mrs. Williams stepping up to the microphone, her voice carrying across the now crowded room. She welcomed everyone and began introducing the various veterans present, asking each to stand as their name was called. The applause was respectful but routine, the kind of polite recognition common at such events. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his seat, already bored by the proceedings. He whispered jokes to his friend Marcus, who sat beside him trying not to laugh out loud. When Mrs. Williams announced that Harold Mitchell would be sharing a few words about his service in Vietnam, Tyler barely looked up from his phone. Harold slowly made his way to the microphone, his medals catching the light as he moved. The room grew quieter, though not completely silent. Some conversations continued in hushed tones, and Tyler could hear the scraping of chairs as people adjusted their positions. Harold's voice was soft when he began speaking, requiring the audience to lean in slightly to hear his words clearly. He started with simple facts: his unit, the year he deployed, the region where he served. Harold had given similar talks before, always keeping the details clean and appropriate for mixed audiences. He never mentioned the worst parts, the nightmares that still occasionally woke him, or the friends whose names were etched on a black granite wall in Washington, D.C. as Harold spoke about the young soldiers he had served with. Tyler's voice became audible to those around him. "Look at all those fake medals," he said to Marcus, his tone dripping with teenage cynicism. "Old guys love to make themselves look important with shiny decorations they probably bought online." Several adults turned to look at Tyler with disapproving expressions, but he continued, emboldened by what he perceived as an audience. "I bet half these war stories are made up. Everyone wants to be a hero when they get old." His voice carried further than he intended, and more people began to notice the disruption. Harold paused mid-sentence, having caught fragments of Tyler's commentary. His weathered face showed no immediate reaction, but those who knew him well could see the slight tightening around his eyes. He had encountered disbelief and disrespect before, particularly from younger people who had never faced real danger or hardship. Mrs. Williams shot a stern look in Tyler's direction, but the teenager seemed oblivious to the growing tension in the room. Other veterans began to shift in their seats, some whispering among themselves about the inappropriate behavior. Tyler's grandmother, sitting 3 rows away, had not yet heard her grandson's comments but noticed people turning to look in his direction. These old-timers probably never even left the United States. Tyler continued, his voice now loud enough for Harold to hear clearly. "They pin on some ribbons and expect everyone to treat them like celebrities. It's all for show." Marcus tried to shush his friend, sensing that the mood in the room was changing, but Tyler was too caught up in his performance to notice. Harold stopped speaking entirely and looked directly at Tyler. The room fell silent as the elderly veteran's gaze met that of the teenager. There was no anger in Harold's eyes, only a deep sadness that seemed to encompass decades of experience Tyler couldn't begin to understand. "Young man," Harold said quietly into the microphone, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I can see you have questions about the authenticity of these medals. Would you like me to explain what each one represents?" The offer was made without hostility, but it carried the weight of a challenge. Tyler, now aware that the entire room was focused on him, felt trapped between backing down and doubling down on his skepticism. His teenage pride kicked in, and he chose the latter. "Sure, go ahead and tell us your stories, but I bet they're not as impressive as you want everyone to believe." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Several veterans stood up from their seats, their faces showing a mixture of anger and protective instinct for their fellow servicemen. Tyler's grandmother finally realized what was happening and looked mortified, but she was too far away to intervene quickly. Harold nodded slowly as if he had expected this moment to come eventually. He had faced enemy fire, lost friends to war, and spent decades dealing with the invisible wounds that never fully healed. A teenager's disrespect, while painful, was not something that would break him. "Son," Harold said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "These medals weren't given to me for being impressive. They were given because of what happened to good men who deserved to come home but didn't. Each one represents a day I'd rather forget but never will." The weight of his words began to settle over the room, but Tyler, caught in the momentum of his own defiance and the attention he was receiving, wasn't ready to back down. He had no idea that his next words would trigger a response that would transform this small community gathering into something none of them would ever forget. Tyler stood up from his chair, his teenage bravado masking the nervousness he felt as every eye in the room focused on him. "Come on. Everyone knows these ceremonies are just feel-good events where old guys show off their costume jewelry," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Half these medals probably came from some military surplus store." The silence that followed was deafening. Several women gasped audibly, and one elderly veteran's wife began crying quietly. Harold's face remained composed, but his hands trembled as he gripped the podium. The teenager had crossed a line that went beyond mere disrespect into territory, that cut deep into the hearts of everyone present. Mrs. Williams started moving toward Tyler, intending to escort him out, but Harold raised his hand to stop her. "It's all right, Patricia," he said softly. "The young man deserves an answer." Harold began unbuttoning his military jacket with deliberate slowness, his arthritic fingers working carefully with each button. "This Purple Heart," Harold said, pointing to the heart-shaped medal with George Washington's profile, "was awarded to me on March 15, 1969, after I spent 6 weeks in a field hospital with shrapnel in my chest and legs. I was 19 years old, son, just 2 years older than you are now." Tyler's confident expression began to waver as Harold continued. The old man's voice grew stronger, more focused, as if the act of defending his service had awakened something that had been dormant. "This Bronze Star was given to me because I carried my wounded radio operator 3 miles through enemy territory after our unit was ambushed. His name was Jimmy Patterson from Des Moines, Iowa. He was 20 years old and had a baby daughter. He never got to meet because he died in my arms 2 days later." The room was absolutely silent now. Even Tyler had stopped talking, though his defensive posture remained unchanged. Harold removed his jacket completely and laid it across the podium, so everyone could see the full array of medals and ribbons. "This combat infantryman badge means I faced the enemy in ground combat. This Vietnam Service Medal with 3 Bronze Stars represents the major campaigns I participated in. Each ribbon, each decoration, each piece of what you call costume jewelry represents days of my life I can never forget, no matter how much I might want to." Tyler's friend Marcus tugged at his sleeve, urging him to sit down and apologize, but Tyler was too proud and too embarrassed to back down gracefully. Instead, he made the mistake that would seal his fate for the remainder of the afternoon. "Okay, so maybe you did serve," Tyler said, his voice defensive and shaky. "But that was like 50 years ago. What does any of that matter now? Why should we care about some old war that nobody even talks about anymore?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge. Several veterans began standing up from their seats, not in anger but in solidarity with Harold. These men understood something Tyler couldn't comprehend, that the bonds forged in combat transcend time, and an insult to one veteran was an insult to all. Harold looked at Tyler with an expression that mixed sadness with determination. "You want to know why it matters, son? Because freedom isn't free. Because the peaceful life you live, where your biggest worry is probably a math test or asking someone to a school dance, exists because young men and women have always been willing to stand between you and those who would do you harm." Tyler's grandmother finally reached him and grabbed his arm, whispering urgently for him to apologize and sit down. But Tyler, now feeling cornered and humiliated in front of the entire community, made one final attempt to justify his behavior. "I still don't see why we have to make such a big deal about it," he said, his voice now clearly shaking. "It's not like you guys single-handedly saved America or anything." That was the moment when Harold Mitchell, the quiet, dignified veteran, who had endured decades of nightmares and survivor's guilt, decided that this young man needed to learn a lesson that no textbook could teach. What happened next would depend on a phone call Harold was about to make to someone whose presence would change everything. Harold pulled out an old flip phone from his pocket, the kind that younger people often mocked as outdated. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. The room watched in curious silence as he stepped away from the podium and made a call that would bring a piece of American military history directly into their small community gathering. Tyler stood frozen in place, unsure whether to leave or stay, completely unaware that his disrespectful behavior was about to trigger a response that would make this Memorial Day celebration one that none of them would ever forget. Harold's phone conversation was brief but intense. Those sitting closest to him could hear fragments of what he was saying. "Yes, sir. I know it's your day off." "No, sir. I wouldn't call if it wasn't important. There's a young man here who needs to understand what service really means." The call lasted less than 3 minutes, but when Harold hung up, his entire demeanor had changed. The sadness in his eyes had been replaced by something else, a quiet confidence that suggested reinforcements were on the way. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold announced as he returned to the microphone, "I've just spoken with someone who will be joining us shortly. I think it would be appropriate for everyone to remain here for a few more minutes." Tyler looked around, nervously, finally beginning to sense that his behavior might have consequences beyond mere embarrassment. His grandmother was mortified, whispering apologies to nearby veterans while shooting angry glances at her grandson. Mrs. Williams tried to restore order to the event, but the tension in the room was palpable. 20 minutes later, the sound of vehicles pulling up outside caught everyone's attention. Through the windows, they could see a black SUV with government plates followed by a military sedan. Several people in the room straightened up instinctively, recognizing the significance of an unscheduled official visit. The doors opened and a small entourage entered the community center. Leading them was a tall man in his 60s, wearing a crisp military uniform adorned with more ribbons and medals than anyone in the room had ever seen in person. The insignia on his collar identified him as a 2-star general, and his bearing commanded immediate respect from everyone present. Behind him walked 2 younger officers and a civilian aide, all maintaining the formal posture that marked them as career military personnel. The general's presence transformed the atmosphere in the room, from a casual community gathering to something approaching an official military ceremony. Harold snapped to attention as best his aged body would allow, rendering a crisp salute that was immediately returned by the general. "General Morrison," Harold said with obvious respect. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." The general's last name caused Tyler to look up sharply. Morrison was his family name, though he had never heard of any military connections in his lineage. The coincidence seemed impossible, but the physical resemblance between the teenager and the distinguished officer was unmistakable to those who looked closely. "Master Sergeant Mitchell," the general replied, using Harold's former military rank. "When you call and tell me there's a young person who needs to understand the meaning of military service, I make time. That's what we do for our brothers in arms." The general's gaze swept across the room, taking in the gathered veterans and their families. His expression was serious, but not harsh, suggesting a man accustomed to dealing with difficult situations, with measured responses rather than emotional reactions. "I understand there's been some question about the authenticity and relevance of military decorations," General Morrison continued, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. "As someone who has had the honor of presenting many such awards, I thought I might be able to provide some clarity on the subject." Tyler felt his stomach drop as he realized the full scope of what his disrespectful comments had triggered. This wasn't just a local matter anymore. His behavior had somehow warranted the attention of a high-ranking military officer who had interrupted his personal time to address the situation. The general walked slowly around the room, stopping to shake hands with various veterans and exchange brief words of recognition. Each interaction was personal and genuine, demonstrating his familiarity with military culture and deep respect for those who had served under different circumstances and in different eras. When he reached Harold, The two men spoke quietly for several minutes. The general examined Harold's medals with the expertise of someone who understood not just their significance, but the specific actions and sacrifices they represented. His nods of approval and occasional comments of outstanding and well-earned validated Harold's service in a way that resonated throughout the room. Finally, General Morrison turned his attention to Tyler, who had remained standing throughout the general's circuit of the room. The teenager's earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing awareness that he was in serious trouble. "Young man," the general said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I understand you have some concerns about military service and the recognition we give to those who serve. Before I address your specific comments, I'd like to know your name." Tyler's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Tyler Morrison, sir." The general paused, studying the teenager's face more carefully. "Morrison, you said? That's interesting. What's your father's name, son?" "My father is David Morrison, sir," Tyler replied, his voice barely audible. The room watched in fascination as the general's expression shifted from stern authority to something approaching surprise and then recognition. General Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying Tyler's face with new interest. "David Morrison from Chicago? The one who works in construction and married Susan Crawford about 20 years ago?" Tyler nodded, completely bewildered by how this high-ranking officer knew personal details about his family. His grandmother gasped softly, finally understanding why the general had seemed familiar when he walked into the room. "Son," General Morrison said, his voice taking on a warmer tone, "your father is my nephew, which makes you my grandnephew, and it means you've just spent the afternoon disrespecting the very tradition of military service that runs in your own family." The revelation hit Tyler like a physical blow. He had never heard his family discuss any military connections, and his father had never mentioned having an uncle in the service, let alone one who had achieved such high rank. General Morrison turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying the authority of decades in military leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you about Master Sergeant Harold Mitchell and why his medals represent some of the finest examples of American military valor I've encountered in my 40-year career." The general began recounting Harold's service record in detail, information that could only have come from official military files. He described specific battles, Harold's leadership under fire, and the circumstances that led to each of his decorations. The room listened in rapt attention as a complete picture of Harold's heroism emerged. The Bronze Star that this young man dismissed as costume jewelry was awarded for Harold's actions during the Battle of Firebase Charlie, where he single-handedly held off an enemy assault until reinforcements arrived, saving the lives of 23 American soldiers. The Purple Heart represents wounds he suffered while refusing medical evacuation until all his men were safely extracted. Tyler stood frozen, the full weight of his ignorance and disrespect becoming clear. Each detail the general shared made his earlier comments seem more shameful and hurtful. "But I want to focus on something even more significant," General Morrison continued. "Harold Mitchell didn't just serve with distinction in Vietnam. After the war, he spent 30 years working with veterans organizations, helping returning soldiers deal with their physical and psychological wounds. He has personally counseled over 1,000 veterans through difficult transitions back to civilian life." The general paused and looked directly at Tyler. "The man you accused of wearing fake medals and making up stories has dedicated his entire adult life to serving others. His example of selfless service continued long after he left the military, touching countless lives in ways that will never be fully recognized or rewarded." Tyler's legs felt weak, and he wanted nothing more than to disappear from the room. The magnitude of his mistake was overwhelming, but General Morrison wasn't finished with his education. "Now, about military service not mattering in today's world," the general said, his voice becoming more pointed. "Every freedom you enjoy, the right to speak disrespectfully to a veteran, the safety to attend school without fear, the luxury of worrying about teenage problems instead of survival, exists because people like Harold Mitchell stood ready to defend it." The general walked closer to Tyler, his presence commanding but not threatening. "Your great-grandfather served in World War II. Your grandfather served in Korea. Your granduncle, that would be me, served in Desert Storm and Iraq. The military service you dismiss as irrelevant is woven throughout your family history. Tyler's grandmother spoke up for the first time since the general had arrived. General Morrison, Tyler didn't know about the family's military service. His father never talked about it, and we lost touch with that side of the family years ago. General Morrison nodded understanding. That explains the ignorance, but it doesn't excuse the disrespect. However, it does present us with an opportunity for education rather than punishment. The general turned to face the entire gathering. I'm going to ask everyone in this room to do something that Harold's service, and the service of every veteran here, has earned them the right to request. Tyler braced himself, expecting to be asked to leave or to face some form of public humiliation. Instead, what General Morrison requested would teach him a lesson about honor, respect, and the true meaning of military service that would stay with him for the rest of his life. General Morrison's voice filled the silent room with unmistakable authority. I want everyone here to stand up. Every person in this room, veterans, family members, children, and especially you, Tyler Morrison, stand up right now. The scraping of chairs echoed through the community center as over 100 people rose to their feet. Tyler hesitated for a moment before complying, his face burning with shame as he realized he was about to become the center of an even larger demonstration. Now, the general continued, I want everyone to remain standing while I tell you exactly what Master Sergeant Harold Mitchell did on April 23, 1969, that earned him the congressional recommendation for the Silver Star, which was later downgraded to the Bronze Star due to bureaucratic issues, not because his actions were any less heroic. Harold looked surprised, unaware that the general had access to classified details about his service that had never been made public. The old veteran's eyes welled up with tears as memories he had tried to bury for 50 years came flooding back. Harold's unit was conducting a routine patrol when they walked into a carefully planned ambush. 12 American soldiers were pinned, down by enemy fire from 3 directions with no cover, and no way to call for help because their radio operator had been killed in the first volley. The room remained absolutely silent, everyone standing at attention as the general painted a vivid picture of combat that few of them could truly comprehend. Harold Mitchell, then a 20-year-old sergeant, made a decision that saved every life in that patrol. He left the limited cover they had and ran directly into enemy fire to retrieve the damaged radio. He was shot twice during that run, once in the shoulder and once in the leg, but he kept moving. Tyler found himself holding his breath, completely absorbed in the story despite his earlier skepticism. The other teenagers in the room were equally transfixed, finally understanding that they were hearing about real heroism, not Hollywood fiction. Under continuous enemy fire, bleeding from his wounds, Harold repaired that radio using parts from his own equipment. He called in artillery support that broke up the ambush and then personally carried 3 wounded soldiers to the evacuation point, making multiple trips while enemy snipers continued to target him. General Morrison paused, letting the weight of Harold's actions settle over the room. The man standing before you today saved 11 American lives that day. 11 families got their sons, brothers, and fathers back because Harold Mitchell refused to accept that any of his men were going to die on his watch. The general then did something unexpected. He walked over to Harold and rendered a full military salute, holding it until the elderly veteran returned it with tears streaming down his face. Master Sergeant Mitchell, on behalf of the United States Army and every family whose loved one came home because of your courage, I salute you. What happened next was spontaneous and powerful. Every veteran in the room snapped to attention and saluted Harold in unison. Then one by one, the non-military attendees began applauding, creating a thunderous ovation that lasted several minutes. Tyler stood among them, clapping with tears in his eyes, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had dismissed so carelessly. The medals weren't decorations or costume jewelry. They were symbols of moments when ordinary people did extraordinary things under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. When the applause finally died down, General Morrison turned his attention back to Tyler. Young man, you have a choice to make now. You can leave here today having learned something important about respect, service, and sacrifice. Or you can continue believing that the freedom and safety you take for granted just happened by accident. Tyler found his voice, though it cracked, with emotion. Sir, I want to apologize to Mr. Mitchell and to everyone here. I was wrong about everything, and I'm ashamed of how I acted. Harold stepped forward and put his hand on Tyler's shoulder. Son, the fact that you can admit you were wrong tells me more about your character than your earlier words did. We all make mistakes when we're young. The important thing is learning from them. General Morrison nodded approvingly. Harold's right, but I want to make sure this lesson sticks. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. Tyler Morrison, I want you to spend a day with me at the base next weekend. You're going to meet some current soldiers and learn exactly what modern military service looks like. He handed the card to Tyler, who accepted it with hands that were still shaking. And I want you to call your father tonight and ask him why he never told you about our family's military history. I think you'll find that conversation very educational. The general then addressed the entire gathering one final time. What happened here today represents everything that's right about America. A young person made a mistake. The community responded, with education instead of condemnation, and everyone learned something valuable about respect and service. As the formal part of the gathering concluded and people began to mingle again, Tyler approached Harold with genuine humility. The old veteran welcomed him warmly, and they spent the next hour talking about military history, family, and the responsibilities that come with living in a free society. Tyler left the community center that day with a completely different understanding of military service, respect for veterans, and appreciation for the sacrifices that previous generations had made for his benefit. The teenager who had mocked an old soldier's medals walked out as a young man who understood that true honor isn't something you wear on your chest. It's something you carry in your heart and demonstrate through your actions every day.